Hola, buenas tardes en Chile. Ya son puntualmente las 7:30 p.m. en Chile y son las 9:30 de la mañana del día jueves acá en Brisbane. Así que quiero darle la más cordial bienvenida a todos y a todas por estar nuevamente por segunda semana consecutiva y han sido partícipe de las distintas actividades en las que hemos desarrollado y hemos estado trabajando con todo el equipo de investigación. El día de hoy tenemos un lujo de exponente. Ella es Freya Patterson. Ella es terapeuta ocupacional de la Universidad de Queensland. Actualmente es la directora de la Escuela de Terapia Ocupacional de pregrado y tiene una vasta experiencia tanto en investigación como en clínica y así, que además del camino académico, del camino, eh, eh, no sé si está grabando, sí, está avanzando. Además de todo el camino eh, académico, docente, es también se mantiene activa en el ámbito clínico. Entonces está completamente actualizada de todos los términos, la forma de trabajo, herramientas, y además también es tremendamente generosa al compartir sus conocimientos. Para la gente que no me conoce y no conoce este equipo, mi nombre es Sebastián Gallego, yo soy terapeuta ocupacional de Chile. Actualmente estoy finalizando mi segundo año del doctorado acá en la Universidad de Queensland y mi proyecto se focaliza principalmente en poder comprender cómo se lleva a la práctica de terapia ocupacional en Chile. Somos más de 17.000 terapeutas registrados en nuestro país. El número de terapeutas está aumentando brutalmente. Son 71 escuelas a lo largo del país y, y no existe una estandarización, no sabemos cómo estamos trabajando y es importante saber qué está ocurriendo en todas las localidades, en todas las regiones, en todos los contextos para saber cómo podemos entregar una mejor práctica y una mejor forma de entregar este servicio y hacer eh, una entrega de mejores decisiones con nuestros pacientes, nuestros usuarios. Entonces, el objetivo principal de esta charla es generar movimiento, invitarlos, motivarlos también a poder reunirnos, asociarnos y principalmente los quiero invitar a ser parte de este estudio. ¿Cómo lo pueden hacer? Participando en todas nuestras actividades. Ya llevamos cerca de 2 meses haciendo desarrollo de casos vía Zoom, live de Instagram, seguir la cuenta de neuroterapia-ocupacional, donde estamos subiendo resúmenes de artículos actualizados, nuevas actividades. La semana pasada estuvimos con Jody Copley hablando sobre extremidad superior hipertónica. La próxima semana vamos a estar con Ignacio Pessoa, que nos va a estar hablando un poco de tecnología y el uso del TMS como herramienta terapéutica. Por lo tanto, hemos tratado de estar con harto movimiento, estar conversando, dialogando, actualizándonos, y los invito cordialmente y respetuosamente a poder ser parte de este estudio con 15 20 minutos de su tiempo para poder contestar una encuesta que yo les voy a dejar y voy a estar subiendo en el chat. El objetivo, la población objetivo de este estudio son terapeutas ocupacionales chilenos y chilenas que se hayan desempeñado o se desempeñan actualmente en el ámbito de manejo de personas con lesión cerebral adquirida. Esto quiere decir TEC, traumatismo encefalocraniano, accidente cerebrovascular, tumores, epilepsia, que haya sido adquirido durante el desarrollo. Así que eso, los motivamos, esperamos que puedan participar. Así que está en una reunión ahora, Freya se va a sumar al final. Tenemos una sesión de aproximadamente 35 minutos con los subtítulos, que lo hice yo, por lo tanto, mucha paciencia y mucha flexibilidad porque traté de traducirlo de la mejor forma entre los pocos días que tuve. Así que espero haya sido de la mejor forma, con mucho cariño que hice este trabajo y espero que haya muchas interrogantes, muchas preguntas, mucha motivación para también desempeñarse en este ámbito. Entonces, voy a dejar este video corriendo y al final vamos a encontrarnos ya con Freya y pueden dejar todas las preguntas que ustedes quieran, comentarios, indicaciones, lo que ustedes quieran y yo lo voy a estar traduciendo de forma simultánea con Freya. Así que espero que estén muy bien, ya somos 25 personas y iniciaremos ya a las 7:36. Así que nos vemos en unos minutos más, así que espero que disfruten mucho esta sesión. Nos vemos.
Hi, everybody, and welcome. Firstly, I would like to thank Sebastian. Thank you for this opportunity to spend some time reflecting and talking with you and this group of OTs who I'm very excited to be meeting, be it virtually, on this topic, reflecting on practice and cognitive rehabilitation. Before I get into the discussions today and the reflections, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands in which I am recording and having these discussions with you. I'd like to pay my respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country and recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. And in reflecting on where I am today at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, acknowledging that this has been a site for learning and sharing for an incredibly long time. And I have the privilege of continuing with that and this opportunity today to share some reflections around clinical practice. So firstly, I'd just like to introduce myself and just tell you a little bit about my background and the context and I suppose the lens that I'm coming to these discussions with. I'm an occupational therapist. I currently work as a lecturer in occupational therapy in the School of Rehabilitation Sciences at the University of Queensland. And I work there 4 days a week and I work clinically 1 day a week in a public health inpatient rehabilitation setting. I have been working for quite some time and have over 20 years of clinical experience, predominantly working with adults following brain injury across the continuum of care. And I've had the opportunity to work both in Australia and internationally as well. In terms of my program of research, my research interests, I have a strong interest in clinical research around rehabilitation and recovery following brain injury and supporting clients to participate in the occupations and the activities that are important to them. My PhD research and subsequent research has focused on the use of group therapy interventions. So as occupational therapists, how can we harness this medium for therapy? And I think this theme will come up a little bit later in some of my reflections. And finally, a program of research and a stream of research around the preparation of students for both professional placements, so the placements they'll participate in as part of their university studies, but also as preparation of students for practice placement and how we use authentic learning experiences to support the development of professional and clinical skills. So that was just a little snapshot about me. In coming to the presentation today, and Sebastian, when you had asked me to do this presentation and this reflection, I really spent some time kind of reflecting on the broad topic around cognitive rehabilitation and working with clients with brain injury. And I think it is such a huge topic, such an incredibly interesting and engaging topic. And I think that I've come up with just a couple of discussion points. And I think for the audience, you may have met a colleague of mine, Jodie Copley, recently at another presentation. And I suppose drawing on, you know, the approach that she took, I wanted to, I suppose, harness and share and reflect on some of the areas of practice that some of the conversations that are arising in practice in Australia here that I think are really important considerations for us as occupational therapists. So I suppose confession from me is that I don't have necessarily answers in this presentation per se, but rather wanted to share reflections and things that can influence our practice and start a conversation, which I'm really excited to be involved with. So thinking about these topics broadly, I wanted to touch on the balance that we have when we think about functional or occupation-based practice and impairment-focused practice, both in terms of assessment and interventions. I wanted to spend a little bit of time thinking about intensity of practice, the importance of context and resources, and how we as occupational therapists navigate working and functioning in different settings and spaces. And then lastly, just some reflections around interprofessional practice. Before I get into some of these reflections, I really would like to acknowledge the breadth of knowledge and expertise and research in this area of practice, both in Australia and internationally. And I suppose that I won't be able to or to refer to all or incorporate all of this into one presentation. Rather, I wanted to use this time today to reflect on, as I said, different areas of practice, different conversations and considerations that are arising, both through the clinical work that I do, but also through the research and the teaching. And thinking about the different stages of someone's journey, where as occupational therapists, we engage with clients and what our role is and the contribution that we can make to patients' journeys. So again, as I said, there is an incredibly significant body of research around cognitive rehabilitation and occupational therapy practice, including guidelines, recommendations, and reviews of practice. So I think we're really getting an understanding of what's happening in our practice in different parts of the world. I think there's still things to learn, most definitely. But I suppose before getting into these discussions, I really wanted to just to highlight that and acknowledge that breadth of research that we can access and we can draw on in our clinical practice. So firstly, I think that as occupational therapists, there is that balance. I mean, as occupational therapists, we have occupation at the heart of what we do. And when I reflect on my practice as a clinician, really with the ultimate goal of supporting the clients to achieve their goals, supporting them to get back to the activities and the roles and the occupations that are most important and valued to them and to their significant others and families. That we're really central in facilitating participation. And there is that balance in, if we think about our activity analysis, if we think about how we analyse and evaluate clients in order to identify barriers and then subsequently address those barriers, that we can be shifting down to have that impairment focus. And I think that balance comes up. I think this discussion comes up frequently at conferences. I know there was a conference in Australia not too long ago where we had a really exciting debate about this topic. And I suppose reflecting on practice that for myself, speaking for myself, and these, as I said, these are my reflections on practice and reflections on conversations I've had with clinicians, that we do want to keep the occupation at the heart of what we do. We want to keep it central to the discussions and the therapy that we're doing with clients. And I wanted to, I suppose, think about, well, sometimes, how do we do that in assessments? How do we keep the occupation and the functional tasks at the centre of this? And in the context, if we're thinking about cognitive rehabilitation, if we're thinking about, if I reflect on the clients that I work with, where, a significant proportion of them have cognitive changes and changes with their functional cognition, that it's important that as occupational therapists that we effectively analyse a client's performance. And that in order to analyse activities, we can and do use performance-based assessments. So performance-based assessments, those assessments that use the very everyday functional tasks that clients will engage with at home and in their communities. And we can do this in a relatively brief amount of time. I think my reflections around these types of assessments, and as I said, this is something that's come up with the setting that I work in, and there are a number of clinician researchers who are active in this space, and I think I've referred to a couple of them with references on the slides, and they are by no means the only researchers in these spaces, but there are a couple of clinicians who are specifically looking at how we assess functional cognition and working on how we can effectively use performance-based assessments in our practice. And I suppose a reflection on this, and I have a number of these assessments, examples, by no means all of them, up on the slides here, in the first part of the slide here. I suppose reflecting that in using these types of assessments, we not only assess our client's ability to perform the task, and it helps us to identify the level of assistance that they require, but we're also able to analyse and determine and break that task down to identify, for example, whether the client initiates the tasks, whether they are able to identify and correct errors, whether the client sequences and executes steps within the task, and whether they're able to demonstrate time management and self-management within those tasks. So again, being able to break down and analyse to identify if there are specific impairments. And I suppose, an outcome of using these assessments is that we're able to identify an individual's strengths, cognitive strengths, as well as their limitations in the context of those tasks, which then can really inform our practice in terms of, it can help us to identify strategies and approaches that may be beneficial in supporting a client's participation in the everyday tasks. So as I said, there are a couple of examples that we are using in our practice, and I've included links to some of those. As I said, these are by no means the only performance-based assessments. And similarly on the slide, I just contrasted, also included, a number of the more impairment-based assessments that we use in our clinical practice. And I think as clinicians, we really, in terms of assessing clients, need to think and think very purposefully and intentionally about when and how much we assess our clients, particularly if I reflect on the journey of clients. And I'm going to pop to the next slide now, where I wanted to reflect a little bit in thinking about the acute hospital settings. If we think about our clients at the beginning of their journeys and the context of an acute hospital setting, and then the client's transitions to inpatient rehabilitation and onto community-based rehabilitation settings, thinking about the amount of assessment clients undergo. This was interesting. This was a number of colleagues that I work with clinically and also at the university who've led this body of research looking at thinking about acute care settings and how clinicians assess functional cognition. And it's I put the link up to the paper there, but interestingly, that the most common method when they surveyed Australian occupational therapists was non-standardised observation of functional tasks. That was the most commonly reported method of assessing function. So I think it's interesting to reflect on that even in those acute settings, we're finding the space to focus on function and to use that function to inform our clinical decision making in that setting. So thinking about our role in discharge planning in acute hospital settings, that we are, even in the, with sometimes limited resources and time in the acute setting, we are keeping occupation and function at the heart through the use of non-standardised assessments. It's interesting to reflect, though, then, that there are a number of standardised performance-based assessments. And I suppose as clinicians thinking about what is our scope for being able to use some of those more standardised assessments in our practice across the whole continuum of care, across all of the different settings. Thinking about interventions, and I suppose in coming to this, really, again, keeping the occupation and the function at the heart of what we do. I've just included, this is just a quick snapshot when I was reflecting on practice and what guides practice, and specifically with regards to cognitive rehabilitation, and thinking about the key approaches that we use, and how, as occupational therapists, do we, whilst in the process of addressing specific cognitive impairments, how do we balance that and keep occupation at the heart of that when we're practicing strategies, when we've identified specific cognitive approaches and strategies, and whether that's about problem-solving training or errorless learning, or whether that's supporting the development of self-awareness through error-based learning, for example. How do we keep the occupation and the roles and tasks that are most important to the clients that we're working with at the heart of that? And I think that it speaks to those conversations around generalization, and the challenges that we can face as occupational therapists in supporting clients to move beyond our care. You know, if we reflect on working in inpatient settings and practicing tasks with clients and practicing the use of particular strategies, and whether that's metacognitive strategies or memory strategies, for example, we may be practicing them in quite structured and perhaps confined environments, and we have a responsibility to really think about how do we support our clients to move beyond that. And I don't know, I put a couple of these pictures up here because I think it's for me it's a reminder to always have at the heart of practice. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I work in an inpatient setting. So when I'm meeting the clients, I'm not meeting them in their homes. I don't have the opportunity to see their workplaces or to see them in their communities necessarily, but I do need to develop a really good understanding of what that looks like for the client. And I think that it does highlight, and I apologise if I'm jumping forwards and backwards here, it does highlight that the importance of that information gathering and getting to know our clients, to really understand what their life looks like for them and the things that they're wanting to get back to. So thinking about what capacity do we have in different settings to support generalisation. And I think part of a really important, as I said, part of that process is really having a clear picture of what does a client's day typically look like when they talk about meal preparation or going to work or completing duties around the home. What does that look like? Because that will really inform how it may inform approaches that we use, but also inform how can we set up our therapy and how can we engage with that client to best stimulate that, to support them in terms of the transition between those settings and to ensure generalisation. The second thing that I wanted to, I suppose, reflect on today in this conversation was around intensity of practice. And I think that that this can be a real challenge in practice. I think if we think about the breadth of research and we think about what's coming out in the research, and we know about the importance of opportunities for practice and opportunities to provide the just right challenge, and the importance of intensity of practice in the context of neurorehabilitation. And I think as clinicians and services, we face the challenge of how do we maximize opportunities for practice within the constraints of the service that we're working within. For example, within the staffing levels, within the funding levels that we have access to. How do we set up our clients to optimize their opportunities for recovery through our considerations of intensity of practice? And I think there are a number of different ways as clinicians we're able to do that. I think as clinicians, we can be incredibly creative in the way that we do that, and access to allied health assistance, looking at home programs or ward-based programs outside of therapy, opportunities for practice. And another way that is, I think, is a topic that's an area of practice that's very close to my heart. I mentioned my PhD research centres around this, is the facilitation of groups, group-based therapy, which is common practice. I reflect on my clinical practice and the settings that I'm familiar with here, that the facilitation of groups is one of the ways that clinicians can look to optimise the intensity of practice. Groups can range from occupation-focused groups, for example, meal preparation group, breakfast group, lunch group, to practice of life skills. So this could include accessing the community for shopping, managing finances, laundry, as well as more impairment-focused groups that may target upper limb and specific upper limb impairments, or specific cognitive impairments, where we provide opportunities for practice of strategy application and remediation activities. I think that if we reflect on groups, in addition to harnessing those opportunities for maximising intensity of practice, there are established benefits of group therapy. And some of those include opportunities for real-world practice. So that is opportunities to practice in scenarios that are more reflective of real life, such as with other people around. You know, a lot of our clients have goals, longer-term goals around returning to work, returning to the community, returning to roles that may involve being a soccer coach for their child or being involved in teams, and thinking about that those roles involve interactions and engagement with other people. Groups also provide opportunities for peer learning and support. So including opportunities to support others who are at different stages of their rehabilitation journey, as well as to learn from others who may be, for example, further along in their journey. And there's also an understanding of a shared experience, which is something that as clinicians, we can't provide. So I think that the value of groups in terms of supporting intensity of practice, but also those other aspects, it means it's an incredibly valuable medium for therapy for us to offer to our clients. I think though, in facilitating groups, and particularly with the population groups that we work with, we do have a responsibility to deliver groups that are well planned and designed, that reflect current evidence, so that they reflect current evidence, for example, around cognitive rehabilitation, but also reflect current evidence around group therapy. And so reflecting on group theory and how we as therapists, for example, harness opportunities for peer support and learning, as well as meeting individual client needs within the group. And I think that's where the complexity of groups is evident, that we're balancing the group goals and group outcomes. We're wanting to ensure that they're evidence-based, both in terms of the specific therapy mediums and approaches, but also reflecting group theory, and balancing that with meeting individual client needs. So how do we do that? And I think that a key reflection from the research I've been involved with and practice is around the importance of planning. That groups need to be very intentionally planned for the specific clients that we're working with. There's quite a significant body of research around different types of groups and different types of groups for working with clients after brain injury. And I suppose I encourage clinicians to really to seek out that research, to look at the therapy that's involved in the group and the planning, but also to really take into consideration the clients that they are directly working with and the planning that needs to be involved so that the groups reflect those specific client goals. So it's that balance. I talked earlier about the balance between function and impairment, and here I think in this context the balance for us is around the balance of group with individual needs and how do we individualize groups. And I suppose that lends itself to the third area of practice that I wanted to reflect on, which was around contexts and resources. And I think this is not a topic that's unique to neurorehabilitation or cognitive rehabilitation. It impacts on us as clinicians across all the settings that we work in, all the population groups that we work with. But I think it is something that we do need to consider in our therapy planning and our clinical reasoning. And it's something that if I reflect on practice in Australia, there are, for example, inequities and differences in terms of access to different funding between states. For example, in one state of Australia, there's a funding program called the Traffic Accident Commission, whereby eligible clients are typically referred to privately funded specialist rehabilitation units if they're involved in a traffic accident. In that one state, that's a different system to other states where clients involved in road traffic accidents won't necessarily have access to private funding or they don't have a comparable scheme. And I think that when we reflect on this, I think that we need to be aware of the influence that this can have on the journey of people following brain injury, and we're working with clients around cognitive rehabilitation, that the funding can influence the intensity that we're able to provide. For example, working across different settings, there might be different staff to patient ratios, which then influence how frequently we're able to see our patients. And so I think, again, I think I confessed at the beginning of this discussion that I didn't necessarily have answers per se, but more rather to reflect on how this can influence our practice. And I think as OTs, we're incredibly creative and responsive and client-centered. And I think regardless of the setting, regardless of the resources that we have access to, we can still meet our clients' needs. We can still aim for that intensity of practice. It may just look different in the delivery if we're working in different settings. I think one of the examples that I had referred to earlier in terms of assessment was around assessment in the acute hospital setting and working within the constraints of acute hospital settings, where in Australia the focus is very much on discharge planning. And what that can mean for occupational therapists is that it influences the time we have available, which can be quite limited to assess a client and make clinical decisions, which then influences the types of assessments that we choose to use. And there'll be a trend to more screening type assessments. And as I mentioned in this body of research conducted about how we assess functional cognition, I suppose it raises discussion points for us about the importance of our choices in terms of assessments, and is there scope, for example, in acute hospital, even in acute hospital settings, for us to still use standardized assessments, but assessments that reflect function and occupation. In this last area of reflection and discussion I wanted to share with you, I wanted to just spend a little bit of time thinking about interprofessional practice, and that as occupational therapists, we do not work alone. And I've been reflecting on my own clinical practice in coming to this discussion with you, and I've had the privilege of working in some really cohesive and effective teams. And there's a whole lot of team members listed on the slide there, and that's probably not all of them. So I apologize if I've left anyone off that. And I suppose I want us to really think about how we can engage with other team members for the benefit of our clients. So, some clinical examples that spring to mind that I've been involved with recently of interprofessional practice include groups that as occupational therapists on the ward we're co-facilitating with other disciplines, such as a think and speak group addressing cognitive and communication changes for clients that occupational therapists and speech pathologists are co-facilitating. And in thinking about future generations of clinicians as well, that when we have students on placements, we're looking at opportunities for students to have that exposure and that experience to observe interprofessional practice, but also to be involved with it, to meet their colleagues, to understand other team roles. Other examples might include collaborative sessions with physiotherapy, occupational therapy and speech pathology, where we've worked collaboratively, for example, with a client around goals around eating, being able to sit up and eat. And we've targeted within that one session with all the disciplines working collaboratively, we've been able to target sitting balance and dynamic balance. We've been able to focus on upper limb function to enable the client to be able to reach for the cutlery and to feed themselves, as well as swallowing from the speech pathology perspective, and speech and communication in terms of being able to attend to a task for longer periods of time, and being able to communicate needs and wants. I do reflect a lot. I have in the setting that I work clinically and also have the opportunity to work with a team of allied health assistants, and really the value and the importance of our allied health assistants. And I suppose one of the things that I reflect on in my practice working with allied health assistants is the importance of our clinical handover, the importance of ensuring that as team members they have sufficient information. If we're requesting that an allied health assistant or a clinical assistant implement a particular program or a particular type of practice, that we are really ensuring sufficient handover, that the allied health assistants are able to implement that particular program in the way that we're hoping it to be designed. And in practice, often what that looks like for me is actually having a joint session with the patient and the allied health assistant, for example, modelling and working through that program, providing the opportunity for the patients and the allied health assistants to ask questions about the programs, about the activities we're requesting that they practice, including why. I think it's really important that we ensure that people understand why we're asking them to do particular things, but also that we have that responsibility to check in over time and to get feedback and to reevaluate those programs. So in working with allied health assistants who may be doing a repetitive practice, for example, with a client, that we are checking in, that we're getting feedback from them around how the program is going. Is it working? What's working well? What might be more challenging? And that we regularly review and update that to ensure that it's meeting the needs of the clients. I suppose in reflecting on this around interprofessional practice, really just I acknowledge that the challenges in day-to-day practice of interprofessional practice, that scheduling and timetabling, staffing can make these things challenging. In some settings, it may be that team members are not co-located. So for example, there might be a physiotherapy department and an occupational therapy department. I think that it's such an important area of our practice. It's an important area of practice that we promote, that we encourage, that we really develop good relationships where possible with the team members that we're working with. And I think if we're working with more junior staff, for example, that we really facilitate opportunities for them to observe interprofessional practice, but also to develop their understanding of different roles. I know that in different settings, sometimes role overlap can occur, and there can be differences and nuances in different team members' roles, but that it's really important that we understand those different roles and that we're able to work together with the client at the centre. And I think that OTs have such a significant role and a significant contribution in the teams that we work in, that we want to be part of that team. So in I suppose finishing for today, I wanted to thank you for your time and again, Sebastian, thank you for this opportunity to share with you just some reflections on clinical practice. If I, as I said, in my split roles around working clinically, but also in terms of research and teaching of occupational therapy practice, when I took some time to think about cognitive rehabilitation and working with the clients that we all do, the things I've touched on today are some things that sprang to mind as considerations and really important in our practice. And I hope that they may have sparked some interest, they may have sparked some further thoughts. I'm really interested in continuing these discussions and reflections, and I do really thank you for your time today.
Hi, Freya. Welcome to
Hi,
this session.
Sebastian. Thank you.
No, thank to you. It was really great presentation. And thank you for all the people who are here in YouTube. And I don't know if you want to say something, a message. Well, I introduced you in the beginning of the presentation, but I don't know if you want to send a message. Bueno, estoy dando la bienvenida a Freya. Le dije que, bueno, le había hecho una breve presentación al inicio de la sesión, pero quiero, si es que tiene algún mensaje previo a hacer este momento de preguntas y respuestas. Freya.
Yeah, thank you, Sebastian, and thank you everyone for engaging in this opportunity. I was really interested and really excited when Sebastian asked me to be part of this.
Bueno, dice que muchas gracias a todos, muchas gracias, bueno, a mí por haberle invitado, pero también muchas gracias a todos ustedes por comprometerse y querer participar en este tipo de actividad. Está muy emocionada porque ha estado, bueno, Freya ha estado participando en varias actividades internacionales, pero es una de las primeras veces que ha participado en alguna actividad con Chile. Así que muchas gracias por su invitación. So that's something else, Freya?
I'm probably okay, Sebastian, to go into talking about questions that you sent me or other questions people might have.
Yes. Well, okay. Está abierto para que ustedes puedan hacer cualquier tipo de pregunta. Recuerden dos cosas. Está también el link para que puedan contestar la encuesta a terapeutas ocupacionales chilenos que trabajen en esta área. Y en segundo lugar, el chat está abierto para cualquier pregunta y yo la voy a estar traduciendo simultáneamente. Sin embargo, le quiero hacer dos preguntas a Freya y voy a iniciar en español para hacérsela en inglés. Eh, este proyecto en función va asociado a, y su experiencia es en Australia, obviamente, pero claro, quiero de alguna forma ver cómo toda esta evidencia que existe a lo largo de todo el mundo, cómo podemos llevarla y cómo podemos transformarla a nuestra realidad en Chile. So, Freya, I would ask to you, your main experience is in Australia, but here the population of the target of this YouTube is in Chile. What do you think, or what is the importance of that occupational therapists have to consider about our own culture and the difference culture and context in our practice, considering that you talk about evidence in another place. So how can I do this approach or use this strategy here in Chile?
Yeah, I think that consideration of cultural differences and understanding the different contexts for research and clinical work is really important.
Bueno, considerando la importancia de la relevancia cultural y contextual, es tremendamente importante conocer cómo se está llevando a cabo la práctica local. Eso es como el primer paso. Freya.
I think even if I think about my work in Australia, being aware of people's cultural backgrounds is really important because it can influence their expectations, and what they value in terms of healthcare.
Bueno, lo importante es que su experiencia y su trabajo que ella lleva a cabo le dan mucha importancia al background y a los valores y a los, bueno, y al todo el contexto y toda la mochila cultural que lleva la persona. Por lo tanto, es súper importante, antes de iniciar, según su experiencia, es conocer muy bien a la persona.
Like one
¿Ok?
example that I can think of is that in terms of recovery and rehabilitation, as occupational therapists, we have that value of independence and regaining independence. And I know that for some cultural backgrounds, when people are unwell, there's different expectations about recovery, which can influence how they participate in therapy.
Un ejemplo que ella plantea es que dentro de los valores y de los aspectos centrales que tiene la terapia ocupacional es que la persona recupere la independencia. Es lo que nosotros como terapeutas ocupacionales queremos. Sin embargo, existen distintas personas o existe un background cultural de que estos objetivos pueden llegar a ser distintos y no, y las expectativas pueden ser distintas. Por lo tanto, es súper importante conocer que nosotros como TO tenemos nuestra propia visión, pero tenemos que estar en sintonía, sincrónico con las personas, con la gente. Freya.
And I think that being aware of, I don't know, yeah, people's cultural backgrounds and what's meaningful to them can really should influence how we deliver our services.
Entonces hay que estar también atentos y muy preocupados de esta mochila cultural, de cómo nosotros podemos también de alguna forma llevar a cabo y hacer la práctica de la terapia ocupacional, porque no todos los contextos son iguales. Tenemos que saber que, ok, queremos algo, teóricamente queremos llevar algo a cabo, pero no sabemos bien si el medio ambiente o el contexto nos va a permitir dirigir nuestra actividad de buena forma como nosotros que esperamos.
One example recently, I was at a course with Joan Toglia, who is an American occupational therapist and researcher, very, very well known in terms of cognitive rehabilitation. And she's developed the multi-context approach, like an approach to cognitive rehab. And she talked about an example that influenced how she developed an assessment.
Bueno, ella menciona a Toglia, que es una terapeuta ocupacional muy destacada, que, ojo, entre paréntesis, hace 2 años estuvo en Chile en un congreso de la Universidad de Diego Portales, si no me equivoco, y ella desarrolló un modelo de evaluación multicultural, multicontextual, en el fondo, donde influencia de cómo se debe llevar a cabo la forma de evaluar y trabajar con las personas.
And the example she talked about is that often in our practice, we might use, for example, meal preparation, like as a functional task to observe a client and to help us identify if there have been any changes with their cognition. But she said in New York City, nobody cooks, everybody orders takeaway food. So working in that context and understanding that, you know, the cultural expectations there were that informed the decision to develop an assessment tool that focused on processes for ordering takeaway, for example.
Ella plantea que en una conferencia en Nueva York, ella plantea que ya nadie, en cuanto hace una analogía con respecto a la terapia cognitiva y que fundamentalmente ella no recomienda o la gente no consume el takeaway, que es el llevarse el alimento para la casa, que prácticamente uno lo que más como expectativa dice, ok, trabajemos en nuestro lugar, pero lleva todas estas recomendaciones para la casa, pero a la gente no le gusta eso. Entonces tenemos que, de alguna forma, lidiar con nuestras expectativas y con la realidad de cada familia y cada persona.
Yeah, I think, Sebastian, was there anything else I can add to answering that question or
Sí,
responding to that?
of course, yes.
Yeah, I think that I think considering cultural differences is such a big discussion point and so important. And I think, Sebastian, you mentioned earlier that thinking about being very critical, I think, in how we use research to look at is the research for an intervention or assessment tool, how can I apply it in the local context that I work in? And are there things that I might need to revise or change so that it actually works and is meaningful in the setting and with the people that I work with?
Eh, ah, mínimo. Okay. Ella también quiere agregar que cree que el considerar esta diferencia cultural de lo que yo estoy investigando, lo que yo estoy trabajando, lo que estamos planteando, es tremendamente importante. Considerar o tenerlo en cuenta de que lo que yo hago no es único para todo el mundo y que la diferencia cultural es muy importante. Y para eso tenemos que ser capaces de dirigir de buena forma la investigación y considerar estas diferencias culturales entre distintas poblaciones. Por otra parte, también preguntarse cómo aplico estas evaluaciones, estas intervenciones en distintos contextos y cómo también va a funcionar. Entonces, cada vez que yo dirijo la investigación o quiero plantear algo nuevo, siempre tengo que dirigir la investigación. Esto es principal, más allá de lo clínico, es ver cómo puede transformarse para toda la gente y no solamente para mis participantes de mi investigación.
And
Okay.
the last thing I want to add, and I promise it's
Sí,
the
obvio.
last thing first, is I think just in terms of considering culture, I think it's important that we develop an awareness of our own culture, of our own cultural backgrounds, and how that influences how we view the world and how we engage with clients. And I think just that awareness that our beliefs may be different to the clients that we're working with, and that we need to have an awareness and ways to be able to have our clients at the center of our care.
Ok. Bueno, habla también, su último punto que ella quiere plantear, habla sobre el awareness, que es un concepto como de tomar conciencia de la diferencia cultural, cómo las distintas personas, como incluso los terapeutas ocupacionales vemos el mundo. Entonces, esa conciencia hay que no simplemente mostrar la visión que tenemos los terapeutas ocupacionales, sino que también ir mostrando, ir conversando sobre este diálogo constante con las personas y con nosotros mismos, con nuestros propios valores y la visión del mundo. Thank you, Freya. I have a question. This could be. I have two. I think that we are gonna finish with these two questions. Rosana Araya, she's doing a very technical question about evaluation and assessment, cognitive assessment. There is any difference or about the cognitive assessment that we use as an occupational therapist, and we cannot cross the boundary or the limit with psychologists, for example. There is something that are any tool or any assessment that you know or think about is just exclusively for occupational therapists.
I think the tools, for example, that I use in practice that are, I suppose, grounded and based in occupational therapy would be things like the PRPP, which is the perceive, recall, plan, perform approach. Sebastian, I think I had that on one of the slides. And it's a framework for assessment of occupational performance. That I would see as very much an occupational therapy assessment tool.
Ok, ella habla sobre el PRPP, que lo estoy buscando acá en la presentación, que es dentro de, de los frameworks que ella está utilizando, que es la que ella tiene mayor experiencia y es particularmente desarrollada para terapeutas ocupacionales. Sí.
The other assessment tools are, there's a number of them developed by Joan Toglia. And I did have one of these on the slides, which was the weekly calendar planning activity. And she has a series of those assessments. She's an occupational therapist and she developed them for occupational therapy practice.
Ok, hay otra que es otra herramienta que es el Weekly Calendar Planning Activity, WCPA, que es desarrollado por la terapeuta ocupacional Doglia, que habla justamente también de un trabajo multicontextual y es también desarrollado por y para terapeutas ocupacionales.
Yeah.
Ok.
But I agree in my practice as well, there are a lot of cognitive assessments that as occupational therapists we might use, but also the psychologists or the neuropsychologists would also use. I think that highlights the importance of those the interprofessional team relationships
Mm.
in terms of planning assessments for patients, so we're not over assessing them.
Sí, bueno, ella ahí habla sobre la importancia de un trabajo y la comunicación que ella mismo planteaba en la presentación sobre este concepto de la interdisciplinariedad, de tener un plan. Lo importante, más que este sesgo o esta disputa entre terapeuta y psicólogo, es hablar sobre tener un plan de qué es lo que queremos evaluar y para qué. La conversación y la comunicación es muy importante y no sobre evaluar. No que los psicólogos hagan y después yo por lo mío como terapeuta voy a evaluar y al final hay una franja que no estamos topando. Entonces, la comunicación es lo que más le da énfasis Freire.
Has that answered that, Sebastian?
Yes, I think that yes, because it was about if there is any cognitive tool exclusively for psychologists or therapeut or occupational therapists. There is another question. I think that they may be somebody who read your CV. And what is your experience about the implementation of group therapy in context in acute people in the hospitalized? What is your experience about the groupal therapy in the hospital?
I won't, but I could talk all day about therapy groups because I think they can be such a valuable mode of therapy in terms of working with clients, particularly after brain injury, but not just in that area of practice.
Bueno, ella dice que bueno, ha sido como que no lo va a hacer, pero ella podría estar hablando todo el día sobre este ámbito que ha sido su desarrollo principal en investigación y como práctica clínica de terapeuta ocupacional.
My experience has been predominantly in rehabilitation. So after that kind of acute medical phase and when the patients have been transferred to inpatient rehabilitation. And I suppose key things I would want to highlight would be the importance of planning the groups to meet the individual group participants' needs.
Bueno, predominantemente su experiencia ha sido en ámbitos de rehabilitación, que han sido principalmente desde un contexto médico hacia el intake, que es el contexto ambulatorio, y esa es su principal experiencia. Y las llaves como como los aspectos destacables que ella habla, que a pesar del trabajo grupal, es tremendamente importante ir desarrollando las necesidades individuales de cada individuo de ese grupo. Freya.
And the other thing I think that's really important to consider is the evidence base. So, and that's within the setting of a group, it's the evidence base for the intervention. So for particular cognitive rehabilitation, for example, or research we know about intensity of practice, but also drawing on evidence and research about groups. So really taking into consideration, like, what are the benefits of groups and how can I ensure that I facilitate that in the groups that I'm running.
Ok, ella plantea como segundo punto clave el hecho de que la práctica basada en evidencia es fundamental sobre la intervención en ámbito cognitivo, ya que si bien no es solamente un trabajo que se trabaja en el hospital o en un lugar específico, sino que tengo que estar atento a cuáles pueden ser los beneficios de acuerdo a los individuos que pueden estar ahí, que no simplemente sea un plan del lugar para todos, estimulación cognitiva grupal, sino que tengo que ver que esta práctica, qué aspectos puedo beneficiar y cómo puedo beneficiar a cada una de las personas. Por lo tanto, la práctica basada en evidencia y cómo implementarla es fundamental.
You know, for example, we know that adjustment after injury is really important for clients, and learning about, you know, their own strengths and limitations and abilities is really important. And groups can be a really supportive way to do that, where patients can learn from each other and they have a shared experience that as clinicians we can't provide that.
Bueno,
Does
ella
that make
habla
sense to you, does Sebastian? Does
Sí,
that
ya,
make
ya.
sense to you? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Habla, da igual. Habla sobre el ajuste que puede existir post lesión, sobre los aprendizajes que pueden existir después de una lesión, que cómo impacta eso en tu vida y cómo tú tienes que hacer arreglos en tu vida. Eh, una de las fortalezas de la terapia y poder responder a Alejandro de mejor forma, dentro de las fortalezas que tiene el trabajo, es el apoyo que puede existir entre los mismos individuos. Entre cada individuo con la experiencia puede apoyar cómo fue el ajuste post lesión. Y también el apoyo que pueden tener desde los mismos clínicos, pudiendo colaborar y haciendo como distintas contribuciones desde los mismos individuos, compañeros y también desde desde el clínico.
But Sebastian, I'm happy if people want to talk more, or, you know, I'm happy for people to email me, particularly if it's about groups, because I would
Okay,
talk
yeah.
about it all day if you let me.
Yeah. Bueno, está súper. Puedo después al correo de todos ustedes, les puedo enviar el correo de Freya, por si es que alguien quiere conversar como específicamente sobre que ya puede estar todo el día hablando, pero si hay alguna pregunta en particular sobre terapia grupal, estimulación cognitiva, por favor, ella va a estar abierta a poder responder. And the last question, this is could be something about a concept. It's very interesting. Delia asked about this. It's very interesting about the concept of functional cognition. I don't know if you are immersed of this term, and what can you say about this? What is your knowledge about?
Yeah.
Because this could be new for most
Yeah.
of the people. So,
Yeah.
what is your opinion about the concept
Yeah.
of? Estoy preguntando sobre una pregunta de Delia que dice que es muy interesante el concepto de cognición funcional, que es uno de los aspectos que hablan muchos artículos en el último tiempo. Y le pregunta a Freya si es que puede desarrollar qué piensa al respecto. Muchas gracias. Thank
Yeah.
you, Freya.
There are some really great resources about functional cognition, and a lot of them are like freely available through the American OT Association, Sebastian. So if people can't access them again, Sebastian, if you let me know, I can forward some of them to you. But I think the concept, it's inherently like it really aligns, and I think it really it can help us to articulate what we're seeing in function. And in my mind, it's how cognition works for people to do the things they want to do. You know, which is really what we're about. And so it aligns itself with using more performance-based assessments. So observing the people do the functional tasks to identify where things might be breaking down.
Okay.
I don't know if that was a very articulate answer, Sebastian.
No, but I can explain in
Yeah.
Spanish, I think. Bueno, en primer lugar, ella plantea de que tiene muchos recursos, principalmente está asociado a la la Asociación Americana de Terapia Ocupacional que si es que gustan, si es que están de acuerdo, yo tengo sus correos, chicos, y les puedo enviar la información que Freya quiera compartir, si es que están de acuerdo. Y en segundo lugar, con respecto al concepto, dice que ella considera que el concepto de cognición funcional ayuda de articulación entre lo que nosotros podemos ver y la real cognición. Entonces está muy alineado a la terapia ocupacional y nos permite poder visualizar de mejor forma la función, cómo la cognición funciona y qué es lo que nosotros podemos llegar a hacer, porque en el fondo se habla sobre la función, cómo desde la cognición, desde lo neuroanatómico, cómo de alguna forma lo podemos llevar a cabo hacia la función y el performance, el desempeño que tenemos las personas y de la cómo podemos llevar a cabo nuestras funciones en el medio ambiente, en el environment. Okay?
Yeah.
So that's it. That was a very interesting. We were here for 1 hour, and I really appreciate your time, your dedication to do this specific presentation for us. So thank you for very much, Freya, and we are happy to work together. And I think that we are gonna have a very good result with this study.
No, thank you. As I said, I was very excited when you invited me and very happy to talk further as well. So as I said, if people, I'm happy people email you and if there's things that I can pass on or further discuss, I'm more than happy to.
Mm. Okay, so thank you, Freya. See you soon. See you maybe
Yep.
next week. Or we work together, so we are gonna see each other. So
Yes.
muchas gracias a todos ustedes, gracias por su tiempo, por su dedicación, por su motivación a estar acá. Esta grabación la voy a editar porque dura demasiado, porque la abrí 1 hora y media antes. Así que voy a editar el video y voy a dejar el link para que lo puedan ver nuevamente en el link de la descripción de Instagram, que está en neuroterapia-ocupacional. Y ahí van a ver todas nuestras noticias. La próxima semana vamos a estar con Ignacio Pessoa, que es parte del grupo de investigación. Y nada, muchas gracias a todos y lo invitamos a participar. Está el link y nos estamos viendo en una próxima ocasión. Así que muchas gracias. See you the,